Welcome to the Weaver Sews. I'm Daryl Lancaster, and this is Mulder. I've been working with my 800 vest pattern and now have two garments using the lining as a seam finish, which I explained in a previous video. All that's left is the collar and binding off the edges and installing a separating zipper. I'll eventually get to those techniques. But today, I want to show you two ways to install the collar in this 800 vest pattern. This is a simple collar. It can stand up, but roll back to create a lovely look around the neck. On the collar pattern section, there is a center back fold line. But in the case of this collar here, since I had little fabric to work with, I put in a center back seam. I've noted with tailor's tacks or thread marks where the collar meets the dot at the front neck and the shoulder seam of the garment. I've fused an interfacing onto the wrong side of the collar lining, but you can add support to the collar in addition or instead of the collar lining by fusing interfacing there as well. This fabric was created from a hand-spun, hand-woven twill, which had been made into a vintage skirt created by my mother-in-law some 50 years ago. The lining is a wool challis shawl from my own mother's stash from probably that long ago. I pinned the vest and lining together at the neck edges. Then I stay stitched the neck edges together following the direction of the grain. That would be shoulder to center front and shoulder to center back. Use normal stitch length and stitch 1/2 inch or 1.2 centimeters from the cut edges. To apply the collar pieces, we're going to create a sort of sandwich. There is no seam allowance on the top edge of the collar, the one without the markings, and there is no seam allowance on the center front edges. These will be bound off later with a separate strip of bias. With right sides together, pin the long marked edge of the collar lining, that's the edge of the collar with seam allowance, to the vest lining, matching the center back, the shoulder, and the front neck dots. Clip the neck edge to the stay stitching if necessary to get a smooth fit. With right sides together, pin the long marked edge of the vest collar to the front face of the vest. Again, matching symbols. Now we have a neckline sandwich. We have the collar lining and the collar pinned on, with the neckline seam allowances sandwiched in between. Stitch through all layers using a 5/8 inch or 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. There is a lot of bulk in here, so we will grade the seam allowances down. Trim the collar and collar lining seam allowances down to 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter, and the neckline seam allowances down to 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter. Press both collars away from the neck edge. Now the vest is ready for the perimeter edge binding. Here I have the blue vest created from the leftover fabric from my Arctic Sky jacket. I talked about the Arctic Sky jacket and this fabric in a Monday Mini. The link for that is below. The lining is a wool pebble crepe from my stash, left over from a different project. Nothing goes to waste in my studio. For this collar, we will be removing the seam allowances and using a separate pair of bias strips to simulate the look of the lining as a seam finish that we used in the rest of the garment. This method is a bit tricky, and certainly the collars can be attached in a normal way as I just demonstrated. I pinned the vest and lining together at the neck as I did on the white vest. I stay stitched, but instead of 1/2 inch or 1.2 centimeters from the cut edge, I stay stitched 3/4 inch or 2 centimeters from the cut edge. Yes, this is below the seam allowance, which we will be cutting off. Trim off the 5/8 inch or 1.5 centimeter seam allowance around the entire neck edge. Make sure your markings stay intact. Pre-cut a 2¼ inch or 5.7 centimeter wide length of bias. Presumably that matches the lining. Actually, you'll eventually need 2 of these. Pin the right side of the bias strip to the lining side of the neckline, keeping the long edge of the bias strip even with the trimmed edge of the neckline. Stitch 1/2 inch or 1.2 centimeters from the trimmed edge, attaching the bias strip to the neck edge. Press the bias strip away from the neck edge, but don't trim anything. This strip will now act as the missing seam allowance. I have 2 collars here. The lining has been interfaced with the fusible. I've also interfaced the hand-woven collar section as it needed extra support. I placed the 2 collars wrong sides together and pinned all edges. Stitch 1/8 inch or 3 millimeters from the long unmarked edge with no seam allowance and the front edges also with no seam allowance to hold them together. This stitching will be covered with the perimeter edge binding. Machine based 3/4 inch or 2 centimeters from the marked curved edge of the collar. That's the edge that actually has seam allowance. As we did with the neck edge of this vest, trim off the 5/8 inch or 1.5 centimeters from the curved lower edge of the collar, being careful to preserve the markings. You are removing the entire seam allowance, so be sure you don't cut off your dots. Pin the right side of a second bias strip to the lining side of the collar, again matching the long edge of the binding strip to the trimmed edge of the collar. Stitch 1/2 inch or 1.2 centimeters away from the trimmed edge. Press the binding away from the collar. Now you have a vest neck and a collar, which both have bias strips for seam allowances. This next step is awkward, as the neck can't flex easily and you have to be accurate. With right sides of the bias strips facing each other, carefully pin the two together as if they were seam allowances. You'll be using them to join the collar to the neckline. Remember, the collar and the neckline have no seam allowances. You'll want to keep checking that the trimmed collar edge and the trimmed neckline edge are exactly even. The symbols should all match. This is one of those times where I'll take the extra step to hand baste the two strips of binding together to make sure everything is accurate. Place the basting stitches just next to the trimmed edges of the collar and neckline, which would have been the actual seam line. If everything is accurate and you are satisfied, machine stitch along the basting line with normal stitches. If you did everything correctly, you now have a collar attached to your vest, but the seam allowances come to the front, just like they did when you used the lining as a seam finish. In case you were wondering why we didn't just cut the neckline lining bigger and bring it to the front, You can't do that technique with curved edges like the neckline. It will never lay smooth and flat. That's why we went to the trouble of creating faux seam allowances with a separate bias strip. So the look is the same, but the end result is much smoother. Press the bias open and fold each side under 1/2 inch or 1.2 centimeters and pin in place. Try to cover the visible stitching line that was created when you attached the bias strips initially. We will use the same stitch we used to attach the lining as a seam finish in the previous video. To review, use a straight stitch if that's all your machine can do, or try a decorative edge stitch like an applique, zigzag, or hem stitch. Next time, we'll bind off the entire perimeter of these two vests, including the armholes, with separate strips of bias. I'm Daryl Lancaster for The Weaver Sews.